Hi, it's Narelle here from Narelle Wood Consulting. I'm going to talk today about how questioning can develop deep thinking and deep thinking learns to deep learning. A couple of weeks ago, I blogged about how success criteria is perhaps a little dangerous, as one of the unintentional consequences of success criteria is that students start to tick the box rather than doing that complex thinking that we know comes from linking different ideas together in different ways. And one of the reasons is that we don't often recognize that thinking and learning and coming up with ideas and doing that sort of linking of ideas is really, really messy. How often do we take out the uncomfortable feeling for students by scaffolding too much or not letting them grapple with the fact that they don't understand something and being okay with that? In other words, we take the challenge out for them and things become too easy, or they're used to being able to have the problem solved for them. And one way to consider this is to have a look at how many of our activities do we set students that are not just hands-on but minds-on as well. If you look to the work of people like Mazzano, Richard, Devani, De Bono, Hattie, the key to this is all about the questioning. We know that open-ended questions, messy questions that students can't automatically Google the answer to, requires a whole lot of deep thinking. And if they're deep thinking, then they're deep learning. Obviously, we want to support them in that. We don't want to set the challenge too hard. We want to give them some skills and scaffolding, but we also need to find that balance and let them grapple with it, which means that sometimes learning might go backwards. It's not going to be necessarily the linear trajectory that we often expect from students. So, one of the things to consider is that teachers often ask about 200 questions a day. Students may be lucky to articulate one question, and what sort of question is it? Is it a how do you spell this question, or what time's break? Or is it a question that shows that they're linking ideas in different and interesting ways? Yesterday, I asked my students in class where they were taught to summarise. Now, a few students came up with the example of, in particular classes, they were taught to find key words, they were taught to highlight and annotate, and then one student looked at me and said, "We summarise all the time, but not necessarily in school." I asked him what he meant and to explain that further, and he said, "Well, when someone asks you, did you see a movie and what was it about, you don't tell them blow by blow description of the movie, you summarise it and distill it for them." What this student had done was connected a conversation from before class that we're having about movies to the question about where did we learn to summarise. And that wasn't necessarily something that, well, it wasn't something that I had ever considered, and it wasn't something that anyone else in the class of 30 students had considered either. And he was absolutely right. We do summarise all the time, and it's a really good example of connecting our outside world experiences into the classroom. So one approach that we can take with students who ask seemingly irrelevant questions is to ask them, well, how does that connect? And sometimes it might not, sometimes it may be something else that they've been thinking about. But what happens when we shut down those questions, when we say we don't have time or they're not relevant? What are we teaching to our students, and what habits are we building about questioning for them? One of the things I've been considering over the last couple of weeks are the types of questions that students ask in my classes, and not only the types of questions, but how frequently those questions happen. It's been something that I've looked at over the last couple of weeks, and I actually asked some of my pre-service teachers recently why there didn't seem to be any questions about both the content that we were covering and also things like assignments. And they raised a really interesting point that often the questions appear later after they've had some opportunity to do some thinking. And that for me has some really interesting implications about the way we teach and what that means for those students who have questions at a later date and where they might go to get answers for those. And that's our topic for next time. Chat to you soon.